Spiraling in the wreckage of a failed love affair, Argentine poet Jorge Luis Borges channeled his devastation into his work, reassessing the slippery nature of our own identities and the way we perceive reality, ultimately securing his place in the literary pantheon. Doggedly fighting against the scientific establishment for his controversial interpretation of quantum mechanics, German physicist Werner Heisenberg dared to accept the experimental evidence at face value, leading him to a principle that has been a guiding light for physicists ever since. Prussian philosopher Immanuel Kant, horrified by the possibility that all knowledge might rest on uncertain grounds, undertook to test the limits of reasons, placing human understanding on a firmer footing than ever before. What these three thinkers shared, in addition to their uncommon intellect, was their skepticism, not only of the accepted wisdom of their culture, but also of their own reasoning. And there is so much more that I could say about that, as I've been reading a book called The Rigor of Angels, Borges, Heisenberg, Kant, and the Ultimate Nature of Reality by a professor named William Egginton. He is the Decker Professor in Humanities and the Director of the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute of Johns Hopkins University. His monumental and riveting account of how a poet, a physicist, and a philosopher pursued truth to the very limits of human apprehension and revealed the fundamental nature of our place in the universe is what we will be discussing today on the Intentional Clinician podcast with Paul Krauss. If you are looking for ethical, fast, and affordable billing services, check out therapistbillingservicesllc.com. That's Therapist Billing Services. Billing services created by therapists for therapists. All right, let's get to the interview. Welcome to the podcast, Professor Bill Egginton. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Paul. It's a real pleasure.
Wonderful. We're going to be discussing your new book, The Rigor of Angels, Borges, Heisenberg, Kant, and the Ultimate Nature of Reality, that is just coming out right now in 2023. This is an interesting book for sure. I've been reading it, and I must say I was not sure what to expect. But I'm not going to give it away yet, but I was curious, what intrigued you to write a book like this? I'd never seen those names sort of together in a book before.
Well, thanks for the question, Paul. And I think we can say with some confidence that there never has been a book that's dealt with all three of those before, and which is not the only reason to write a book about them, of course. But I had been thinking about the topics in this book, essentially how people coming from radically different ways of thinking about the world or engaging with the world, from poetry, from physics, from philosophy, can converge around an understanding an idea of how humans interact with reality. And I've been thinking about this and teaching about it and writing little pieces about it for a long, long time. And then as I started to work on the shape of what would eventually become this book, one of the key questions for me is, well, this is a huge philosophical journey. Who are the three characters who are best poised to take us on this journey? And I took several stabs at it, to be honest. An early version had a similar number of chapters to the version that you have now, so something like with an introduction and conclusion, about 14 chapters, 12 of which were content, and each of them was dedicated to a different character from the history of philosophy. And this was getting scattered in a way. It lacked a through line. Then I said, well, let me put that aside and try for something completely different. And then I focused on a philosopher from the 4th century, 3rd and 4th century, Boethius, whom I write about in this early in one of the chapters of the current book. Then I just realized that was too much weight for this one character to carry, and needed to be more than that. So fewer than 12 characters, more than 3. And then it hit me that about a decade ago in the New York Times philosophy forum called The Stone, I had published a little piece that had exactly these 3 characters in it. And so I went back and I reminded myself of what the intersection was, and that was it. It had been there. I'd already written about it, and I said, "This is perfect." Now, what I need to do is really blow up all three of these characters, really dive into their lives, dive into their preoccupations, spend time with them, and then weave them together into one coherent story. And so that was the ultimate structure that came out of it. The historical structure is basically that it's almost, you can think of it like a V in time. Kant is Kant's going to turn 300 years old next year, whereas Borges and Heisenberg shared the 20th century. So they were very roughly contemporaries from the beginning of the 20th century till the 1970s in Heisenberg's case, 1980s in Borges's case. And both of them were deeply influenced by Kant, each in his own way. And so that ended up being the structure of the book. It tells the story of their thought through the story of their lives, and kind of wraps them tighter and tighter around each other until you get to the conclusion.
Excellent. Thank you for that. That's what I was noticing when I was reading through it. It seemed like not a philosophy book, because it got me into it from their story of their lives, and then like what they were thinking about and kind of what they were going through at the time in their personal lives. And so that's what set it apart for me from a standard philosophy text espousing thoughts about different philosophers and different people. And obviously Kant is the philosopher here, and Heisenberg, the physicist, and Borges, the poet. And it seemed to me that you were also going, as far as I've gotten in the book, is that showing how their thoughts not only sort of kind of interwove or intersected, but also how they evolved over time. Is that what you were kind of going for?
For sure. And because each of them is a human being, and each of them has a story, and that story involves fits and starts. It involves obsession. It involves, in some cases, love and loss. But it's always about evolution and change in the end. And I think what each of these characters, each of these great thinkers, transformational in each of their fields, ultimately was able to do was to converge upon an extremely important insight about our relationship to the ultimate nature of reality, but to do so in a way that was very loyal to what they were doing. It was loyal to language and poetry and storytelling in the case of Borges. It was loyal to the experimentation of high energy physics in the case of Werner Heisenberg, and it was loyal to the whole history of thought and philosophy in the case of Immanuel Kant. And what was extraordinary to me, and what was so compelling about the story, is that these three very different ways of grappling with fundamental questions would ultimately be revealing of something so presciently similar.
Yes, I think that is why a story becomes interesting versus just explaining what they thought and why, and here's the bullet points on that. I feel like you really wrapped it up there in ways that I was actually unprepared for when I got the book. So I was really intrigued. I also saw throughout the book that you had quotes from different texts that they had written, different letters they had written, different historians' takes on them, which I thought were really interesting, because you could see, depending on the source, the language was different than kind of our modern language, and some of the observations were really interesting. So I felt that it really gave it, instead of it just your opinion about what was going on back with Immanuel Kant and in the career of Borges and Heisenberg, it was like people sort of talking about them in real time or around that time. That was kind of what I was interpreting.
I mean, I'm really trying to jump into the historical moment in each of their cases and try and bring that moment alive. But in each case, we're talking about people who changed an entire sector of humanity's way of viewing things, right? There would be no modern physics or modern science without Werner Heisenberg's discoveries, without the robust debates that he was involved in the early part of the 20th century. There would be no modern philosophy without Immanuel Kant. He really, in many ways, set the stage for everything that we do in modern Western philosophy today, and much of our thought today is a response or an attempt to come to terms with Kant. And Borges had a very similar impact on 20th century literature. It was often said about Borges that the most surprising thing about Borges was that he didn't win the Nobel Prize for Literature, which I get into a little bit about the controversies about that at the time.
Yes. And another thing I noticed was, like, I guess you said this already, so we'll get into some specifics here in a moment, but generally, some of the scientific discoveries of Heisenberg and others, because he was really debating with people about the way he thought about things. He was different than a lot of the people that came before him. But then you were seeing these concepts mirrored almost, I guess I would say, in philosophy and poetry. Is that kind of a rough way of saying that? What would
No,
you
I think
say?
that's right. I mean, in an interesting way. So you would think that the physicist would be the one who's sort of in a way the least responsible to or responsive to the history of thought, because what matters, in at least for our modern understanding of science, what matters about physics is experimentation, and then coming up with an adequate explanation for experimental results, putting that into a context of perhaps recent scientific papers. But what struck me was that in explaining the unexplainable, that what Heisenberg eventually did was turn to philosophy. And this was despite the fact that many of his contemporaries considered him, quote unquote, unphilosophical. They were all grappling with big philosophical issues. But when they called him unphilosophical, what they meant was he had a particular philosophical take, which was not one that they were recognizing. Because when they were referring to Heisenberg as unphilosophical, his contemporaries were saying, well, he's not trying to picture what's happening inside an atom. And the rest of us, we're trying to figure out what's going on there. Well, Heisenberg was. He was very much picturing what was going on inside the atom. He wasn't picturing it in a form of pictures that his contemporaries, many of his contemporaries, or most of us would accept as a picture of reality. In other words, he was willing to accept that reality at the microscopic, at the atomic level, does not behave the way that we expect it to based on our experiences in the world of classical physics. And that was a radical move on his part. And it was one that then retroactively I was able to say, you know what? This is extremely similar to what Kant said about our relationship to the ultimate nature of reality. And it's extremely similar to what Borges worked out through a series of stories, and stories that would ultimately lead to, in fact, the title of this book.
Yeah, and I've highlighted some parts and some sections that maybe I'll ask you about in the book. I have to say, as much as I've loved reading this, I was not a philosophy major, so a lot of this stuff, I get the ideas, but I'm not fully sure how to explain them to a podcast listener. So perhaps you could help us out with that.
Sure.
I guess what I would say is the revolution of Heisenberg, noticing that in certain spheres, this is what I was catching the gist of from the book, like gravity and all of these laws sort of seem to play out in our like 3D world out here, but on a microscopic level or way out in space, they are different. Is that what he was sort of saying with some of his study?
Heisenberg's very specific discovery, starting in 1925, and then shortly thereafter, in 1927, he produced his most famous paper. But he already won. When he won the Nobel Prize for Physics, he won it principally for the paper that he wrote in 1925. His discovery was, or his special move, if you will, in physics, was to pay attention to the before and after measurements of spectrographic measurements of positions of electrons in an atom. What had already been realized prior to this was, and this is already in Niels Bohr's, his mentor's model of atomic shells, is that electrons have different energy levels, and they can change if you pump an atom full of energy. That you can hype up, if you will, the behavior of the electrons, but they always fall at a particular distance, if you will. They always cluster or they swarm around a nucleus at a particular distance, depending on the energy level. And what's really bizarre about it, so you can imagine, this is the way that people used to imagine this. It's not entirely accurate, but it's helpful as a heuristic. The model of an atom being something like the model of our solar system, a nucleus, and then a variety of orbits around it. And yet the fundamental difference, and it really is a fundamental difference, is that those subatomic particles like electrons, they can be in the orbit of, say, Earth or the orbit of Mars, and they can sometimes change from the orbit of Earth to the orbit of Mars, but they don't seem to exist between those two places. And this was already known. What Heisenberg did was to calculate and come up with the actual formula that would express and predict the movements from one to the other. And he was able to do so in part by accepting this philosophical point that at the atomic level, there's no need to account for the position of something until you've measured it. And that, in fact, even further, he went on to speculate, which ended up being experimentally proven to be true, that particles can't be said, and makes no sense logically to say that they have a position or have had a position as they get from point A to point B until you measure them. And it's only at the moment that you measure and observe them that it makes sense to say that they now have taken a particular path. This was incomprehensible. I mean, it still is for most people. And part of what I'm trying to do with this book is make it comprehensible. It's to say the reason that we find it, or as in Richard Feynman's famous words, something along the lines of no one can make sense of quantum mechanics, right? The idea that it just fundamentally doesn't make sense, that this is true only insofar as we approach the data of quantum mechanics with a certain notion of reality in mind. And it's that notion of reality, that space and time exist independent of us, that motion by particles of all sizes through space and time occurs on paths, and those paths exist whether they're being observed or not, that this is not an adequate understanding of reality for understanding quantum mechanics.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people that have talked about the fact that we have now found upwards of 60, I'm going to butcher this, but 60 something subatomic particles beneath the atom, or is it more, or beneath the electrons? Is it more than that now? Below that. Okay.
Yeah, below that level for sure. And they correspond to energy levels. In other words, the higher you pump your energy physics, the more the potential of finding what are called heavier and heavier particles that otherwise, because mass is equivalent to energy, if you don't have the energy to produce them in a lab, you're not going to actually find them.
Right. And then there's the quarks that seem to spring in and out of our perception of reality at a small level, and we don't know how they can jump from one side to the room or the other, whatever, one side of the particle to the other. So that's something else
that's the very same phenomenon that already in the case of electrons, Heisenberg was studying and was coming up with a theory for, which is, yes, we call them quantum leaps or quantum jumps, but essentially it is at the fundamental level of matter and energy. Until you make a measurement, a particle doesn't have a location, which means that it can be theoretically anywhere until you've made a measurement. And hence this is the very phenomena that accounts for leaping or jumping. If it can be anywhere until you've made a measurement, that means it can be potentially over here or potentially over there, or in what's called quantum tunneling, a particle can theoretically be on one side of a barrier, but there's some percentage chance that it could be on the other side of the barrier. When you measure, you make a measurement, it appears over there, and you say that the particle has tunneled through the barrier. But that's not something that the particle did. It didn't actually build a tunnel or create a passage from one side to the other. It was following the principle that Heisenberg discovered, which is when you measure it, it's only at that point that it has a trajectory, that it has a path.
Right, and that is difficult to understand, but I think that's probably why it was so controversial at the time. And so I had a passage here that it was actually in the introduction. Your introduction was very rich. And there was this large, I guess, analogy or story about Zeno and Achilles, and Borges was thinking about that. And I'll read the quote, but maybe if you could kind of explain.
Sure.
It was like the tortoise versus Achilles and how they came across, if you can kind of go with that.
Oh, I will. No, gladly. So this is one of the famous expositions of what are called Zeno's paradoxes. And the purpose of Zeno's paradoxes were to prove sort of through negative proofs, through ad absurdum proofs that something along the lines of change or motion is impossible. So this seems like a completely absurd notion, and the people that he was arguing with 2,500 years ago in the Agora also took it as such, and yet he was saying, look, we're philosophers, so take me on my word. You have to try, and you can't just say it's ridiculous what I'm saying. You have to show me where the fault in the reasoning is. And so this was presented to Socrates, and Socrates went through a series of back and forths with Zeno and his master Parmenides at the time. So I tell this story in part because of how much it fascinated Borges, and the problem that Zeno presented as one of the many ones for his proof that motion change is illusory is he said, look, imagine Achilles in a race with a tortoise, and Achilles gives the tortoise a head start. The problem is we think Achilles is faster than the tortoise, but if you actually think about it mathematically, Achilles will never catch up with the tortoise. And everyone said, "What are you talking about?" Well, and he said, "It's quite simple. You let the tortoise get 10 meters ahead of Achilles, and then Achilles takes off. In the time that it takes Achilles to get to the 10-meter mark, the tortoise has moved a little bit forward. Now focus in on that. Do the exact same thing again. Maybe it's 10 millimeters now. At some point it will be. In the time that it takes Achilles to cross that distance, the tortoise has again gone forward." Anytime you start to think about time and space as infinitely divisible, you're going to run into this problem that in fact it should be an infinite amount of time to pass. Well, the answer before the one passes, the answer to that in some sense in calculus is that it's not an infinite amount of time. As John Stuart Mill said, and Borges was responding to him, he said, yes, it will take forever, but that forever will already be over within 12 seconds. And then something else is going to happen. And Borges brilliantly answered to that. That's not an answer to the problem. It's an exposition of the problem. The problem is still there. Why is it that we run into that difficulty? And the point of telling that story is that these issues of apparent paradox, where we have on the one hand, Achilles is clearly going to win the race, and on the other, when we analyze it mathematically, we seem to come up with this infinite abyss that Achilles and the tortoise are falling into in space and time. How do they get around it? Kant, when thinking about space and time, basically proved that any time that we try to imagine something that's taking place in space and time as if it were external to space and time, or vice versa, we're going to fall into precisely that kind of a paradox. And he called these the antinomies. And then these antinomies are how I tell the story of that's throughout the book, how I structure the book in the end.
Yes, and I'll quote the book because it was quite an interesting paradox to me. The paradox of Zeno, Borges wrote, is an attempt upon not only the reality of space, but the more invulnerable and sheer reality of time, existence in a physical body, immobile permanence, the flow of an afternoon in life are challenged by such an adventure. Like Heisenberg working feverishly on the other side of the world as he explored the limits of perception, Borges peered into the abyss of an apparent paradox. And like Heisenberg, instead of shying away from his paradox, he chose to re-examine his most basic assumptions about time, space, and causality. And I think what you're saying a lot here in the beginning of the book is that, and I guess this is probably a big point, is that all three of these characters were willing to kind of use the scientific method in the most purest form, I suppose. I don't know if they knew they were doing it, but essentially away from that confirmation bias, saying, I think I'm wrong. I think we could all be wrong. Maybe we need to look at this a different way. So I'm not sure if you want to, you kind of already explained that part, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think the way that you just put it in terms of confirmation bias is a really neat way of putting it. We have a confirmation bias about our most fundamental kind of image of the world or picture of the world. And one of those, and this is kind of a quotation of Borges, one of those images of the world is that it's the world being everything, space, if you will, and the universe, that it's ubiquitous in space and steady in time, right? That things last. That if we're going to measure change, it's against a kind of permanent backdrop of being. That space and time are something in which things occur, and if we use them as measurements, they're measurements of things that take place, right? One thing after another. What Borges and through his stories, what Kant through his philosophy, what Heisenberg in his minute analysis of the results of physical experimentation, all kind of ran up against, was the idea that space and time, to a certain extent, are qualities that we, as measurers of the world, bring with us. And these assumptions, once we make the mistake, if you will, of projecting these assumptions about how the world is out into the world, we're going to run into problems. It's going to make us think that our experiments are producing paradoxical results. It's going to produce paradoxes in philosophy, and it's going to produce what Borges beautifully called interstices of unreason, that he said were there to remind us, and that his fiction is really a way of delving into and exploring, to remind us that the world that we live in is, to a certain extent, always a world that we've dreamed up, that we've created, that we've built or made to our own measure.
Oh, that's really great the way you put that, because now this brings me into where I'm a little bit, where my expertise lies in psychology. And so perhaps this is a projection, but possibly a theory, that humans in the thought evolution, going back thousands of years, looking at, first the world was flat, then the world was the center of the universe, then the God was in the sky or on the mountain, and then, the rain meant this and this meant that, and it depends on where you are in the world, right? So Native Americans, they believed there was like spirits in every single possible thing. Like everything had, it's like, can't remember what they call it, pan-spiritualism. Everything has a sacredness, right? And it's all part of this story that we're in. And so part of me, though, goes to the psychology of the way that people were grappling with science and the nature of reality, was that it's actually very scary to think about the world in a non-fixed sort of way, because then are we safe, right? Like if the planet Earth, according to me, looking outside right now, doesn't seem to be hurtling through space at how many thousands of miles an hour, orbiting some burning up, star, and have a thin atmosphere. If I didn't know that, I'm like, oh, it looks pretty nice out there. I think that's great. But when you turn in all those other things, it's impossible for me to comprehend it. I've never been on a space shuttle and seen that,
Right.
or even any moment of that. And so I think it is a fear factor as well. It's a denial. I want to be in denial. I don't want to think about hurtling through space. And wait a minute. In fact, not only our solar system is hurtling through space, the galaxy which we find ourselves in is hurtling through space. And possibly at the middle of that is a black hole. And possibly that could collide with another galaxy. And if that happens, we're really in for it. Right. And so, these sort of things, I think the average people and even the scientists at the time, it was frightening, perhaps, especially during Kant's time, especially frightening, because they were kind of coming out of an era where there was the sky god dominant idea that sort of held the world in the hands of the sky god, and the sky god would, pick and choose the winners and losers. So that was my projection or theory on that. I'm not sure if you have anything that you want to add to that.
I think your idea of sort of coming up with, or what the safety blanket that you're describing, is one of comfort, right? It's right. We stick with the set of beliefs that we have because they're a more comfortable belief. And I think a great example from the stories that I'm recounting in this book about that is, in some ways, one could argue the most stunningly brilliant of perhaps all of the characters is not even one who ends up in the title. We know him he's sort of gone down in history as the most brilliant man of the 20th century, and that's Albert Einstein. What's interesting about the story that I'm telling is that Einstein, in almost all of these debates, ends up being wrong. But he ends up being wrong in extremely interesting ways. And in fact, in being wrong on some of these debates, Einstein was sort of the only character I can think of who could be wrong and do so in a way that would actually push science forward, because he would think so clearly and put out these thought experiments in a way that was so crystal clear that it forced everyone to really take stock of what they were claiming in their in their interpretations, for example, in the interpretations of quantum mechanics. In the case of Einstein, you can see this very clearly because he was so outspoken about his beliefs and his, if you will, philosophizing about what the physics was at the time. And so when these very famous sentences of Einstein's about the old one does not play, or I refuse to believe the old one plays dice with the universe, even though he was pretty much an atheist, what that tells us is precisely what you're describing as kind of a safety blanket, right? It was uncomfortable, even for someone who had discovered the principles of special and general relativity, even for someone who had himself launched the quantum age by the discovery that light can be both a particle and a wave and has property of both. These were all discoveries by the same guy, and yet he himself was unwilling to fully come to grips with his own discoveries. And that's in some ways, when Heisenberg, in my take, wins out on some of these debates, the fundamental difference is that he has what I describe in the book, and what Kant also had and what Borges had, was an uncommon willingness to accept kind of the appearances and the results of experimentation, or the results of their thought processes, even when they ran in the face of, and even when they undermined these long-held certainties about the way the world must be.
Yes, excellent way of putting it. We've been talking a lot about Heisenberg, and so I kind of wanted to get a little bit into Kant, which,
sure,
he's a tough one to understand. He's so smart, and growing up, I love the story about him growing up and kind of people like seeing that early on in his life and sending him off to this horrible boarding school. But I guess I'm still in the beginning of all my papers here. But with Kant, you were talking about the critique of pure reason, and this is something that you wrote, and then we'll see what. And this is sort of kind of going off what we were just talking about. Kant managed to work out in his critique of pure reason is something so profound that few people fully grasp its implications even today. Hume, which is another philosopher you talk about, and pretty much everyone else had made an unwarranted assumption about what goes on when we perceive something. The assumption is that we are correct in visualizing reality in itself as being consistent with our image of it. But our perceptions, Kant realized, aren't things in the world. Rather, they are versions of those things that we construct in our minds by shaping them in space and time. When we imagine the world as being identical to our conception of it, when we assume specifically that space and time are fundamentally real, our reason becomes faulty and science responds with paradox. Of course, he didn't stop there, I'm paraphrasing. In the second half of the book, he went on to describe in detail the paradoxes that pop up when we fail to make this distinction and mistakenly assume that time and space are inherent. He called one class, what you said earlier, which I'm going to butcher, the antinomies.
Antinomies.
Antinomies, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Those crevices of unreason that Borges credited with confirming the hallucinatory nature of the world. Specifically, Kant wrote, we can picture reality as being consistent and continuous, or as being broken into discrete chunks. And we can make perfectly logical and coherent arguments supporting both conclusions, even though those conclusions explicitly contradict each other. This happens because we assume something about reality that only comes into play when we observe it, going back to what we were talking about earlier. So any thoughts on that?
Well, absolutely. This is the key, right? The critique of pure reason, which took him like a decade to get into its final form, and probably more if you think about all of the thinking that went in prior to his even getting started on writing it, is rightfully considered to be one of the most important books in the history of philosophy. And the first part of the book is describing precisely how we construct the world in the form of what he calls the pure forms of intuition, which are space and time. When we assume, however, that the world in and of itself without our intervention, prior to our looking at it, prior to our making observations, is also structured in that same way, that space and time are not our ways of intuiting how the world is, of making sense, of putting it into form, but rather that space and time are out there in the world. Then we're going to run into paradoxes. And these paradoxes, as I said, one of the forms of the paradoxes that he describes are antinomies. And antinomies, precisely, the example that you were just quoting from there, is a kind of antinomy that physics runs into and examines the very, very small. The antinomy of, well, are you going to come down to a fundamental particle that you can't break, or is possible that you can break every one down and then divide it further and divide it further? And so Kant, long before there was any kind of a means, long before there were electron microscopes, long before there were atom smashers or anything like that, Kant could kind of go through this experiment in his mind. And he brilliantly, amazingly, 150 years before there was even the experimental means to start doing something like this, he started coming up with the similar paradoxes that high energy physics would be running into in the 20th century. In other words, he discovered an antinomy there. And the antinomy is something that you can make a perfectly reasonable argument for one thing and a perfectly reasonable argument for its exact opposite. And in and of themselves, neither of those arguments break down. So how can that possibly be the case? And the one about what's called the atomistic antinomy that we're discussing right here is you can make an argument that any measurement of the world can be divided in half, can be divided further in half, and this can go on and on for infinity, which is what Zeno was doing in his dialectics around the question of movement. Or you can make an argument that there is an ultimate level beyond which you cannot break the world down, that there are fundamental atoms and that these can't be broken down. Each of those is a perfectly upstanding, fine argument to be made on its own, and yet they come in radical contradiction with each other. And Kant's realization was they come into contradiction with each other necessarily because we're taking something that isn't in space or time because it's everything, namely the entirety of the universe, and we're trying to think about it as if it were something you could break down in space or time. And that's a category mistake. Whenever you try and do something like that, you're going to run into errors and paradoxes of that kind.
Yes, I love this idea because, not that I could write this book, but there are many parallels to modern psychology in what I would say is this error that humans have been making forever, and most humans still make, which is that humans are separate from nature. Mm-hmm. And that is a story that comes from multiple religions, although I don't think we're actually in the original scripts. That's sort of a modern interpretation of most religions, is that humans are the special creature that is removed from nature, that has been given nature in some way. I'm quoting Christianity. That's the main one. There's other ones that have similar takes. And when you do that, there is a bit of what I would call a dissociation from the self. Mm-hmm. And that the self is part of nature, is a natural thing. And there's even more so a disassociation from the body and intuition, right? And intuition and the body are something that in the modern world, in the cities, in the way we live now, is kind of becoming a lost art, although who knows what, there's not one truth. We're in like this weird era where, of course, at the same time, what's becoming popularized is yoga and breathwork classes and things to kind of help you regulate yourself. So this idea that humans are separate from nature, and that also when humans say things such as, well, this is the way it is, and this is what history says, and this is the right way to think, and this is the wrong way to live. These sort of things reminded me of that because they are a sort of assumptive narrative that whoever has the loudest horn or most charisma is correct about the nature of reality, when in fact, there isn't really an objective reality. Like like you can see this like whenever there's a crime committed, right? And there's multiple witnesses. Everyone has a different version of the reality. And the only version of reality that we could say is, quote, correct according to the human terms is the video camera footage of this crime, which even then is up to interpretation, because we don't exactly, maybe it wasn't a cinematic thing. It was a security camera. It wasn't like filmed from multiple angles, and we don't know the motivations of those involved. And so when I was reading this, at some point in the book, you were sort of talking about how Kant, excuse me if I'm wrong here, but he was sort of railing against the idea of this objective truth and objective reason in a way.
But it's an important nuance that we have to make here.
Yeah.
Kant was in some ways rescuing something along the lines of objectivity, but with a very special caveat to it, right? Kant said, look, he was reacting to, you mentioned him before, but the Scottish empiricist David Hume, and Hume was threw a grenade into the self-satisfied rationalism of the late 17th and early 18th century, which really said, look, the world functions according to these perfect laws. Those laws are also inside us. Reason, we can figure it out. It's just a question of working it all out. And David Hume said basically the opposite. He said, what a bunch of hooey, what arrogance on the part of humanity. What you have is an impression in the here and now, a flash in the pan. You think that you get used to it. You get used to waking up in the morning and seeing the sun. All that is habit. It could easily wake up tomorrow and there'd be nothing, and there's nothing you can do about it. There's no laws of nature. All there is you getting used to things in a certain way that could change at any particular time. This was the kind of philosophy that in Kant's own reckoning, he said, woke him up from his dogmatic slumber. And so by dogmatic, he meant he was kind of a rationalist like everyone else at the time. And he read this and he said, oh my God, what am I going to do about this? And so he set out to put science on some kind of to use this word, objective footing. But it couldn't be that old rationalist way of saying, yes, we ultimately do have access to the way things are in the world, reality as it is in itself. Reality will ultimately correspond to this reasonable map that we make of it in our mind. He had to let that go because of the power of David Hume's philosophical attack on it. However, what he was able to do was he was able to rescue a kind of objectivity, which we could call sort of a communal objectivity. It's the idea when you're describing this scene of the scene of the crime. Well, what is it that's objective in the end? Is it really, do we just say we all have our own version? Well, ultimately, we have standards. We have standards of evidence. We have ways that communities come together and make decisions. And those decisions, ultimately, then they can maybe be appealed, but then there's standards for appeal. In other words, there's a community that then ultimately decides what the truth is, or what actually happened, or what the law of nature is. And as long as we have the humility to say we keep on applying these standards, we keep them open to reason, we keep them open to critique, as long as we're able to do that, Kant would argue, yes, we have something along the lines of objectivity, which is to say it's not each on his own. It's not everyone just throwing out whatever interpretation that you want. No, there's standards for argumentation, and those standards actually come from the fact that we are beings who have to communicate with each other. And that if everyone had exactly their own version all the time, we'd actually not be getting any kind of conversation done at all.
Yes, that does exist in the universe of internet commenters.
Right.
So that's a fun fact. If you ever really want to get ill, just read YouTube and social media comments or comments on the news articles. They're real fun. But yes, I totally love that you said that, because I love that because yes, exactly. It's something about that shared objectivism versus we have the exact answer. The exact answer changes with new information. And we have standards of the scientific method.
Believing that it doesn't is what Kant called fanaticism.
Right. Yes.
And his whole approach was to ward off, to give us kind of guardrails against fanaticism on the one hand and paradox and error on the other hand.
Right, and it's like those two extremes. In psychology, we see the two dialectics in some symptomatic illnesses, or I guess whatever you call them, states of being, I think they are would be rigidity and chaos.
Yeah,
that humans are going between
paranoia and schizophrenia, or right.
Yeah, like the rigidity is I'm anxious, I'm over here, I'm controlling, I need to be safe, and chaos is this utter. So yeah, he was playing with the dialectics. So I'm glad that that you covered that. So another thing, since you've been hinting at this, which is a big point of the book, is to not believe they had the temptation to know, quote, God's secret plan.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess this is where you got the title of the book, was from Borges' writing, where he wrote, but humanity has forgotten and continues to forget that it is the rigor of chess masters, not of angels.
Mm-hmm.
Could you explain that a little bit? I thought there were so many ways to look at that. But
there is, and it's a beautiful story. When I teach this story to my students, I often preface it by saying, I don't know what you're going to think, but this is, for me, probably one of the greatest short stories, if not the greatest short story ever written. It's a short story called Plun, Bucbar Orbis Tertius. It's about 10 pages long. He wrote it in the early 1940s in the midst of World War II. He ends this story, and it's a story about a secret society, basically a secret society that sets out to create an entire culture, a world, an alien civilization, and to do so from the ground up, to create its language, to create its histories, its mythologies, its encyclopedias, and everything like that. What Borges imagines is the creation of a world of such extraordinary rigor that the way that he does this is a kind of eerie. It's almost like a science fiction story, because he jumps into his own future and he writes a postscript 7 years later, so 1947. And from the vantage of this postscript, he describes a world that has basically been invaded by this idea, and where reality itself has started to give away. So objects that are imagined suddenly become real, and they're objects that really they don't abide by what we understand to be the laws of physics. So, if you will, the fabric of reality is torn apart by this perfect imagined world. Right? That's the idea behind it. And the way the narrator of the story kind of rationalizes or explains this is, he says, the problem is that the way we of that society at the time, but he also implies us, all of us, the way that we tend to imagine reality is it's going to give way. It's going to give way under the pressures of fundamentalisms, of fanaticisms, of people who think that they have the ultimate answer for us. Why? Because we forget, and we forget again, that the rigor that we find in the world is a rigor that we bring into the world. That's the rigor of chess masters. But we forget, and we think it's a rigor of angels. We think that the angels created that rigor, that time and space pre-exist our entrance into the world, that the tools that we use to analyze the world are in fact in the world the way that they are in and of themselves, and that is a problem. This is what what's so amazing about Borges's fictional analysis. Precisely that kind of thinking is the kind of thinking that and this is Borges saying and not me, because remember, the time that he's writing this is during World War II, that he says leads to political perversions like anti-Semitism, like Nazism, and he lists several others in the very context of the story. So he's drawing precisely those kind of conclusions, that our tendency to think that the world awaits us with all of its rules intact, and that we don't bring that rigor to the world, is potentially the same kind of way of thinking that's going to lead us to fanaticism, fundamentalism, and to a kind of violence that we exert on each other.
Yes, I agree with that. There is this I've been reading a few other books recently about just the way the human ego functions. And obviously that's still a theory, and the ego is a theory, but the idea of it being that, let's say there's two different countries that have been at war for hundreds of years, and because of all these traumas of killing each other, they at some point they lose the view of their shared humanity, and they completely rationalize and justify the killing of children and anyone. Like I can't remember who did this, but there was somebody who executed everyone with glasses because he thought they were intellectuals. Was that in your book?
Mao,
No, I'm
I didn't write
books.
about that,
Okay.
but that sounds like Mao Zedong.
Yeah, that's who it was. Yes, and so like this sort of extremism exists when humans believe they have this absolute correctness, and that's the fanaticism that sort of comes in. We're losing, the shared learning, or our shared progression together, and that we are people, and we are, I don't know, still every day figuring it out. What in the world that means?
Always figuring it out. Exactly. Right. And when you think you've already got the answer and you don't need to figure it out anymore, that's when the real problems start.
Right. That's when I always joke in psychology with my supervisees. I say, whenever you think you have a person figured out, that means you're wrong, and you need to stop, and you need to realize that you don't know anything about them. So that's when you got to start over. But
exactly. Yeah.
But back to the book here. This podcast has psychology and philosopher listeners, so that's why I throw in those things. This is the same problem of being in it, right? We're in it, and we're assuming that these things were here, but they weren't here. We made them up. Was the manuscript of 1942, same time of period of Borges was writing the story. We have the Heisenberg's manuscript, and it wasn't appeared until, I guess, the 70s when they found it.
Yeah.
And he was working on a fission reactor for Germany at the time, because of,
in the 1940s. Yeah.
Right. As Heisenberg describes the basic problem in his 1942 manuscript, science translates reality into thought, which is pretty cool. I like that. And humans need language to think. Language, however, suffers from the same fundamental limitation that Heisenberg discovered in nature. We can focus our language down to highly objective degrees where it becomes particularly well-defined and hence useful for scientists studying the natural world. But to the extent that we do so, we necessarily lose another essential aspect of words, namely their ability to have multiple meanings depending on how we use them. He goes on to talk about the first language is static and the second is dynamic. And so I felt like that kind of fit with what you were saying about, we made up language, right? And language, perhaps, according to evolution anthropologists, was not something we even fully developed in the way that we do it now. There was a lot of eye movements and pointing and maybe songs or who knows what going on. And that's why psychologists still say today that according to, these completely ridiculous measurements, that something about like people are noticing more how you say it and the way your gestures are and the way your face moves more than the actual words, and that the words are secondary. But most people, you would never, most of us would never perceive that as true. So I guess thoughts about that. One caveat, just a little psychology nugget, is that Carl Jung thought about that a lot and wrote about that humans thought and were able to make meaning, he believed, easier with symbols,
right,
and archetypes, and symbols of archetypes rather than words. So anyway, back to you.
Yeah. So, Heisenberg was writing the 1942 manuscript, and this is, again, one of those examples of how I try to demonstrate that Heisenberg is in many ways, despite what his colleagues thought about him at the time, that he was unphilosophical, was in fact extremely philosophical. He was searching constantly for the ramifications, the impact, the ultimate meaning of his discoveries on the world. And he was arguing with philosophers and really getting into it. The 1942 manuscript he circulated to friends and colleagues at the time. He felt that it could have gotten him in trouble with the Nazi government that was already seeking, ways to get him demoted or thrown out of the university for various reasons. This manuscript is absolutely fascinating. And my favorite part of it, indeed, is about, and I discuss that in the book, this realization that Heisenberg comes to, that the same problem that he's discovering in nature, that you can either look at or sort of you can focus in, and this is the famous formulation of the uncertainty principle is that you can focus in on and reduce the delta, reduce the variance of your measurement of a particle's position to zero, so you know exactly where it is. But if you do so, you lose all sense of what its momentum is, or you can focus in entirely on its momentum and you lose all sense of where it might be in the world. And there's no way of splitting that. There's no way of getting that of ironing that difference out. It's not a bug that's kind of slipped into our way of looking at the world. It's actually a feature of reality itself. That's, in a nutshell, the uncertainty principle. Here was Heisenberg thinking about all the different ways, all the different filters that we have, that we necessarily have for understanding reality. And he was putting his finger on language as being one of the most fundamental ones. And in so doing, he was locating in language itself something very much along the lines of his uncertainty principle. He said, look, you can really focus in on the exact meaning of things. And that's how physicists like to use language. But in so doing, you're going to fundamentally lose something else that language gives us that allows us to do things with those insights, right? To come up with theories, to make sense of, to interpret. And he called all of that work that language is doing for us, that allows thought to take place. He called that the dynamic or the poetic side of language. And he said, really, our interaction with the world depends on both. But because it depends on both, we can never have an absolutely pure, perfect, distilled, exact language for the world, nor thought for the world. It's always going to suffer from the same kind of blurring, if you will, a kind of minimal blurring that he discovered to be at the heart of reality itself.
Wonderful. Yes, that's a very good way of saying it. I want to ask you a question just about some of your favorite things. But before I do, one last dialectic I was really excited about was, because I'm huge into psychology nerd here, is when Kant's friend died. This is kind of like more of the biographical part you were talking about. Kant's friend Funk died. And he was having a great time before that. He was, lecturing, going to Cedar, staying out late.
He was living a great social life, and then he spiraled. He fell into a deep depression after that.
Yeah, and this is what you said here in the book. Kant was becoming increasingly convinced that humans. After losing his friend, and also his other friendship with Green. Kant was becoming increasingly convinced that humans simultaneously occupied two radically separate realms. One realm was dominated by the relative and shifting logic of time and space, while the other was guided by unchanging truths. And yet, strangely, the one realm somehow necessitated the other. Moreover, this division of human existence into two incompatible and yet mutually indispensable realms implicated all aspects of our endeavors. While he could not yet articulate his insight with the crisp, devastating logic to come, his writing and lecturing increasingly strove towards an idea that would not only clarify the nature of human knowledge, but also provide a roadmap for a more practical question of how to determine a basis for morality. And there's more. That page is gold. There's way more there. But thoughts on that?
Well, I can tell you the whole story of how that works out, but that's sort of the second part of the book.
We don't want to do that. That's a preview. This is an appetizer. That's not the meal.
Exactly. But yes, indeed, what Kant, the excitement of reading Kant and the excitement of seeing, the development of these ideas in the context of his life is the realization that all of these areas of philosophy, be it describing how we can know the world as it is, describing what the experience of beauty is in the world, and ultimately figuring out, is there something like moral rectitude that we can depend on and know what the right thing to do is, that all of these are tied together, and that they come together in one of the most elegant, perhaps the most elegant system of thought, of pure thought that's ever been made. And the point that I'm making in the book, that these insights are then relevant to the kinds of discussions that we have about physics, the kind of discussions that we have about literature as well.
Yes, excellent. And so for the listeners out there, we have been discussing for 1 hour probably just the introduction in chapter 1. Just to let you know, I had a lot of notes all over the place, but there is no way to get to all of them. So I'm just going to give you a little preview for the listener here. You broke it down in the table of contents, but also in this pamphlet that I was sent, but you have a whole part 1 called Standing on a Sliver of Time, and you're talking all about all the things we just talked about. I'm not even we can't probably preview all this, but part 2 is Not Being God, which, and you're interweaving all of them throughout all the 3 characters, real characters. Part 3, Does the Universe Have an Edge? Which sounds really fun. I'm not there yet. That's where I kind of left off. And number 4, The Abyss of Freedom. And just all of these, and again, going through their lives, kind of, because I guess, especially during the last part, Heisenberg is defending his decisions during the war and things like that. So I guess to the listener out there, I definitely recommend picking up this book because it is not your typical dry philosophical academic book. It's a story, and you can learn by that's the side effect. You're going to learn, and your brain is going to hurt, because my brain has been hurting all week, not from any sort of substances, but just from it's hard to conceive of this.
To grapple with these ideas. I hear you.
And the 2 realms, I guess, for the psychology people out there, I would say, is something we see in our practices every day, in that we have one part of the person where we're trying to help them become more entangled, if you will, with the present moment and how their body is and how their breathing is and what their habits are and what's going on in the micro of their life, because that can really help your mental health. But if you don't attend to the macro, the environment, who you're hanging around with, what air you're breathing, what kind of mattress you sleep on, what sort of, health is your body in, and your relatives and the people you engage with, that can also, completely devastate. So it's like an intersection, right? Like a Venn diagram, but there's even more factors in psychology. But if you think about that, we're contending between those 2 worlds as well. And this is definitely a really gross juxtaposition with the philosophy portion of the book. But I think that knowing philosophy and learning about it and learning about physics and learning about what the poets say, because that's what makes life interesting, is poetry and music and art. And well, that's one of the things that makes life interesting, but it really paints a picture. Knowing about these things helps you not only in life, even if you're not a philosopher, and it also helps you in your own personal psychology, whether or not you're a psychologist or just an average listener to the podcast. So that's my pitch for the book. I wanted to ask you, Professor Bill, about what is one of your favorite things that's come so far out of writing this book. What's one of your favorite occurrences or events or personal events that's happened because of this?
I've obviously read and thought a lot about these issues for a long, long time, but and I did a lot of math and science as a younger student. But then I clearly went into literature, and that's my field, is comparative literature, and I'm a professor of humanities at Johns Hopkins. And in order to write this book and really give it kind of the oomph that it needed, I had to spend a lot of time reading up on physics, even though I'm not a physicist. And I have to say, one of the great kind of moments for me was the realization that I could explain and even come to some of the most up-to-date interpretations of quantum mechanics, not from the perspective of someone having studied the physics themselves, but rather from the perspective of being a reader of Kant, of being a reader of Borges, a reader of the history of philosophy, a reader of the history of literature, and thinking through with as much intensity as possible some of these fundamental ideas, and that one could glean or derive some of these ideas and discoveries from thinking and reading literature and thought, and then still make, and not just still, but maybe as a result, make very coherent interventions into the interpretation of modern physics. That was, for me, an extremely important insight.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That's excellent. And I know that you've got multiple. How many books have you written? It looked to be almost 10. 9?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I'm not exactly sure. I've got
Oh.
this one coming out next month. I've got one after that. I think that's the 10th book that I've written, but there's others that I've edited or translated. So I would need to check that don't quote me on it.
Oh, yeah, I'm not, because I can't even myself was having trouble counting in this document I was reading. But I think that is a good gift you're giving to the people out there, because to be fair, this is my little joke. Unless, there's always the library. So go to the library if you have no money. But if you have money and you've gone to a coffee shop anytime in the last couple of weeks, you have spent enough money to buy this book. So this book will last you a lot longer. And you can have coffee at home if that's what budget is. So that's my little joke there. So yeah, I guess, well, let's see. Are you still teaching full time as well? Or part-time?
I teach at, so I run the Humanities Institute. I'm chairing a department, and then I also teach usually a course every semester. So I'm going to teach a first-year seminar. I'm going to start in a couple of weeks with brand new students at Hopkins on poets, physicists, philosophers, and the ultimate nature of reality, which you'll recognize from the subtitle of the book. And then I'll teach a graduate seminar of some kind on in the spring. Actually, it's going to be on psychoanalysis, so we can come back and talk about that.
Okay. Yeah, I'd love to have you back, and it's one of my favorite topics. So, well, and that being said, thank you so much for your time, Professor, and yeah, thank you so much.
I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you, Paul. It was a lot of fun.
And there you have it. This has been another episode of the Intentional Clinician podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please share it with people you know. I would surely appreciate it. Or take just a minute to give us a rating on iTunes. As most of you know, I am passionate about preventing future violence in the United States. My colleagues and I have started a nonprofit called the National Violence Prevention Hotline, a 501c3 organization. We are endeavoring to gain funding and collaborators so that we can start a 24/7 hotline and chat line to reach potential perpetrators before they act violently. It is a bold effort to save lives and curb violence by working to connect with potential offenders while they are in the planning stages of violence, help to de-escalate them, and provide resources so that they can get appropriate professional help. The National Violence Prevention Hotline is looking to open up a conversation about violence in society, the causes, and the solutions. You can learn more by visiting our website, www.violencepreventionhotline.org. Join us online by signing our petition on the website, sharing the website with your network of people, donating to the cause if you like, and you can now even write your congressperson from our website with a simple form. I've said it before and I'll say it again. If you are a therapist looking for ethical and excellent medical billing services, check out therapistbillingservicesllc.com. That's www.therapistbillingservicesllc.com. Billing services created by therapists for therapists. If you're looking for an EMDR International Association consultant, I am a consultant and I can provide you the 20 hours you need to become EMDRIA certified. I have groups online and in person, and I do individual consultation. Just send me a message at the website and I'll get back to you. If you want to get trained in EMDR therapy, check out the great training opportunities with EMDR Training Solutions. I've worked with them before and they are phenomenal, so register today. If you are in need of counseling, do not hesitate to make an appointment at a local counseling center in your area. You can also make an appointment with the excellent clinicians in the Grand Rapids, Michigan area at Health for Life Counseling and the Trauma Informed Counseling Center of Grand Rapids by visiting www.healthforlifegr.com. The recording you just listened to consists of the personal opinions of Paul Krauss and his guest. And while these are based on the literature they have read and the experience in their fields, this should not be viewed as a definitive opinion on any subject. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for treatment. If you're in a crisis, please dial 911 or the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 988. You can also text 741-741 and a live trained crisis counselor will respond. Did you know you could support your local bookstore by shopping at www.bookshop.org? You can order from the comfort of your own home online while supporting local brick and mortar businesses near you. If you are a therapist and you are not a member of your national or local therapy organizations such as the American Counseling Association or the American Mental Health Counselors Association, please get involved. At least pay the dues. It will help the lobbyists in our field keep us from becoming gig workers. And of course, there's the bonus of increasing mental health education around the United States and helping people understand what counseling is and promoting best practices within our profession. Until next time, I wish you all a safe and peaceful week.